What happens when a struggling chef sacrifices her dreams for a mysterious call from a stranger? Meredith's single act of kindness turns her world upside down, uncovering secrets, lies, and a path to unexpected wealth. But is she ready for the price of the truth? Meredith's days began before the sun rose, her small hands already covered in flour as she prepared the first batch of bread. The little restaurant she ran, tucked into the corner of a worn-out street, was her life's work, a haven of delicious aromas and modest dreams. Yet, the strain of unpaid bills and dwindling customers weighed on her like an invisible chain. Every meal she plated was crafted with love, though she often wondered if anyone noticed. Despite the financial pressures, Meredith carried herself with quiet dignity. Her neighbors adored her food, but loyalty didn't always translate to paying customers. The leak in the ceiling went unattended, and the paint on the walls peeled slightly more each day. Even so, Meredith held on to hope, believing that one day, someone would see the magic she poured into every dish. Her restaurant was more than a business, it was a part of her soul. She often found herself dreaming of what could be if money wasn't an issue. The idea of a gleaming kitchen with tools she couldn't yet afford felt like a far-off fantasy. Meredith didn't envy the wealthy, she simply yearned for stability. Late at night, the glow of her dimmed lights reflected her thoughts. Could all this effort truly amount to something more? She had no idea her answer was on its way. Life in her part of town wasn't glamorous, but it was colorful. The community was a patchwork of lives stitched together by laughter, hardship, and resilience. Meredith's restaurant was often the backdrop for intimate celebrations or quiet moments of solace. People relied on her in ways they probably didn't realize. Her food was comfort, her presence steady, but Meredith rarely allowed herself the luxury of leaning on anyone else. Her grandmother's words rang in her ears on nights when exhaustion weighed her down. The hardest battles always make the sweetest victories. But Meredith was tired of battling. The world around her seemed to move forward while she remained stuck, hustling for pennies when others threw away fortunes. Yet, in her heart, she knew she couldn't give up. Something was waiting for her. She just didn't know where to look. It was a regular Tuesday when the call came through, interrupting her work on a new recipe. Meredith picked up the phone with flour-dusted hands, her voice tinged with the exhaustion of a long day. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Emma, her tone frantic and urgent. She needed Meredith's help, desperately. For a moment, Meredith hesitated. Her own struggles screamed for attention. How could she possibly take on someone else's problem? But Emma's story was impossible to ignore. A ruined dinner plan, an important guest, and no one else to turn to, it all sounded surreal. Meredith's first instinct was to say no. She had her own reservations to manage, and every penny counted that night. But Emma's desperation resonated with something deep within her. Against her better judgment, Meredith promised to think it over. She hung up, her thoughts racing. The idea of leaving her restaurant unattended filled Meredith with unease. What if tonight was the night she finally turned a profit? What if Emma's problem wasn't even that big of a deal? Doubts swirled in her mind as she returned to her work, though her hands trembled slightly. The decision she was about to make would change everything, but Meredith had no way of knowing just how monumental it would be. That evening, the air in the restaurant was heavy with the comforting aroma of roasted garlic and simmering sauces. Meredith worked with her usual precision, plating dishes that felt like pieces of art. Her focus was sharp, but Emma's desperate voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't every day a stranger called, begging for help, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Her regulars filled the tables, and tonight's reservation list promised a rare full house. Midway through service, her phone buzzed again. This time, Emma's message was even more urgent. "Please, I'll pay anything," it read. Meredith's heart twisted. The promise of money was tempting. Her debts loomed large, but leaving her restaurant on one of its busiest nights felt reckless. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. "Not tonight," she murmured, but the unease stayed with her. Meredith's mind raced with excuses. She didn't owe this woman anything, she had her own problems to solve. But as she stirred a pot of risotto, she couldn't help imagining the scenario Emma described. An important dinner ruined, a woman in distress, and no one willing to help. Meredith bit her lip, torn between her obligations and an inexplicable pull to do something for a stranger. Her kitchen staff noticed her distracted energy. "Are you okay, chef?" one of them asked cautiously. Meredith nodded, though her thoughts betrayed her calm exterior. Her team relied on her leadership and her customers expected excellence. Yet, Emma's predicament felt like a test, one she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Meredith hated leaving things unresolved, and this situation was gnawing at her. As the dinner rush intensified, Meredith moved on autopilot, her hands working with practiced ease while her mind replayed Emma's words. The mention of important guests stuck with her. Who was Emma? And why was she so desperate for Meredith's help? The mystery nagged at her, tempting her curiosity and softening her resolve. She wasn't the type to abandon her post, but something about this felt different. The night wore on, and Meredith found herself glancing at the clock more often than usual. Her inner conflict grew louder with each tick of the second hand. On one hand, she owed her patrons the same dedication she always delivered. On the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that this call for help was bigger than it seemed. Her gut told her to act, but her responsibilities held her in place. It wasn't just about the money, though that would have helped immensely. For Meredith, it was about principle. She had built her restaurant on the foundation of trust and reliability. Turning her back on it, even for a few hours, felt like betraying everything she had worked for. But Emma's voice, that desperation, Meredith knew it would haunt her if she didn't do something. By the time the last dessert left the kitchen, Meredith was at her breaking point. She leaned against the counter, wiping sweat from her brow, and stared at her phone. The unanswered call from earlier stared back at her like an accusation. Her heart pounded as she imagined Emma's situation worsening. "I'll regret this," she whispered to herself, already bracing for the consequences. Meredith took a deep breath and dialed Emma's number. The line rang twice before a breathless voice answered. "You'll do it?" Emma asked, her tone laced with equal parts hope and exhaustion. Meredith hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. "Yes," she said finally, her voice firm despite the storm raging inside her. The words were out, and there was no turning back. Meredith stood frozen after hanging up the phone, her mind a flurry of doubts and fears. What had she just done? The decision felt impulsive, almost reckless. She had spent years building her restaurant, sacrificing nights, weekends, and even friendships to keep it alive. Closing the doors, even for one evening, felt like gambling everything she had worked for on a single coin toss. Her staff exchanged puzzled glances as she paced the kitchen, muttering to herself. "This is madness," Meredith finally said, stopping mid-step. The idea of leaving on the busiest night of the week seemed absurd. What if she lost a loyal customer? What if her absence led to mistakes? Her restaurant's fragile reputation couldn't afford any more hits, and neither could her bank account. Every time she tried to convince herself it was the wrong choice, Emma's voice came back to her. There had been something raw, almost desperate, in the way she had pleaded. Meredith hated herself for caring. She barely knew this woman. And yet, deep down, she felt an inexplicable pull to help. Still, her practical side fought back. "I can't save everyone," she told herself, as if trying to build a wall around her emotions. That wall began to crumble when she walked through the dining area. The lively chatter of her regulars, the clink of glasses, and the warm light bouncing off the walls, all of it reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place. Meredith loved creating moments of joy for people, but tonight, joy was being replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. Could she really ignore someone in need? She leaned against the counter and closed her eyes, inhaling the familiar sense of rosemary and garlic. Memories of her grandmother flooded back, how she had taught Meredith to cook with love, not just for those who could pay, but for anyone who needed nourishment. Her grandmother's words echoed like a whisper, "Kindness doesn't wait for convenience." The memory brought a lump to her throat. Meredith shook her head, annoyed at her own sentimentality. "This is crazy," she muttered again, but her resolve was weakening. Every argument she had for staying seemed hollow when she thought of Emma's desperation. It wasn't just about food, It was about stepping into someone else's storm, even when her own life was far from perfect. The conflict gnawed at her, refusing to let go. Her sous chef interrupted her thoughts with a hesitant question about the next day's prep schedule. Meredith answered on autopilot, her mind elsewhere. She glanced at the clock and realized she was running out of time to decide. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. It was now or never, and the uncertainty was suffocating. Meredith grabbed her coat and stared at the restaurant's sign through the window. It wasn't just a name, it was her identity, her legacy. Leaving it felt like leaving a piece of herself behind. But staying? That felt like ignoring everything her heart was telling her. "This might be the worst decision of my life," she whispered, grabbing her keys. As she stepped outside, the cold night air bit at her cheeks, jolting her senses. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, and for a moment, she questioned everything again. But then she thought of Emma's trembling voice, the vulnerability in her words. Meredith sighed deeply, her breath visible in the frosty air. "Let's get this over with," she said, walking toward her car. As Meredith drove through the dimly lit streets, her thoughts drifted back to her grandmother. She could almost hear the old woman's voice, gentle yet firm, reminding her of the importance of generosity. "Kindness is a seed," her grandmother used to say, hands busy kneading dough. "You plant it not for yourself, but for the shade it will bring to others." Those words had shaped much of Meredith's life, even if they didn't always make things easier. The car rattled as she passed a pothole, snapping her out of her reverie. "What am I doing?" Meredith muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The doubts still gnawed at her, but her grandmother's wisdom refused to fade. She had watched that woman give tirelessly to others, even when their family had little to spare. It wasn't about expecting something in return, it was about knowing you'd done the right thing, no matter the outcome. Meredith's mind wandered to a memory of her childhood, standing on a wooden stool in her grandmother's kitchen. The two of them had spent hours cooking meals for neighbors in need, often with ingredients scraped together from their own cupboards. "People won't remember the food," her grandmother had told her. "They'll remember how you made them feel." The words rang in her ears now, as if the old woman were sitting beside her. She felt a pang of longing and regret. Somewhere along the way, she had let the harshness of running a business overshadow the simple joy of helping others. She had become so focused on survival that she'd forgotten the deeper meaning of her craft. The call from Emma, as inconvenient as it was, felt like a chance to reconnect with that forgotten part of herself. It was a terrifying thought, but also strangely liberating. The streets grew quieter as Meredith approached Emma's address, her hands trembling slightly on the wheel. She thought about turning back one last time. No one would blame her, not her staff, not her customers. But then, she remembered her grandmother's unwavering gaze, the way she always believed in Meredith's potential, even when Meredith doubted herself. That belief was a gift, and tonight, Meredith realized she had a chance to pass it on. Her car came to a halt in front of an imposing house, its windows glowing warmly against the dark night. For a moment, Meredith just sat there, staring. The contrast between her modest restaurant and this grand estate couldn't have been starker. She felt small, out of place, and completely unprepared. But then she whispered to herself, "You're here now. See it through." Stepping out of the car, Meredith took a deep breath and tightened her scarf against the chill. Her grandmother's voice echoed once more. "The hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations." Meredith didn't know if that was true, but she was willing to find out. She squared her shoulders, trying to summon the strength her grandmother had always seen in her. As she approached the front door, her reflection caught in the glass made her pause. There was a flicker of something she hadn't seen in herself for a long time, a quiet determination, a spark of hope. It was fleeting, but enough to carry her forward. She pressed the doorbell, the chime resonating through the quiet night. The door opened, and Meredith was greeted by a stern-looking woman whose expression was anything but welcoming. "You must be Meredith," the woman said, her tone clipped. Meredith swallowed her nerves and nodded. She was here now, and there was no turning back. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this night would change everything. As Meredith stepped into the grand foyer, She was struck by the sheer scale of it all. The chandelier above her glittered like a sky full of stars, casting intricate shadows on the polished floors. This wasn't just a house, it was a world apart from her tiny restaurant, where chipped tiles and second-hand furniture told a story of resilience. She felt small, almost out of place, but there was no time to dwell. The stern woman from the door, who introduced herself as Mrs. Hastings, was already marching down a hallway, expecting Meredith to follow. The air inside was thick with tension, each step echoing sharply in the silence. As they reached the kitchen, Meredith's heart sank. It was enormous, outfitted with gleaming appliances she could only dream of, but it was chaos. Half-unpacked groceries cluttered the counters, and a pile of broken china sat ominously in the sink. Mrs. Hastings turned to Meredith, her expression a mix of skepticism and disdain. "Fix this," she said curtly, before walking away without another word. Meredith exhaled slowly, trying to calm the storm building inside her. She hadn't signed up for this level of disaster. But there was no turning back now. As she assessed the mess, her hands itched to bring order. This was familiar ground, at least, the chaos of a kitchen, the challenge of creating something out of nothing. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, pushing aside her doubts along with the clutter. A young woman appeared in the doorway, tentative but smiling. "Hi, I'm Lily," she said, her voice soft but warm. "I'm supposed to help you." Meredith glanced at her, surprised by the kindness in her tone. Most people in this house seemed too busy or too stressed to care. Lily's presence was a small comfort, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone in this. "Thanks, Lily," Meredith said, and for the first time that night, she felt a glimmer of hope. As they worked side by side, Meredith found herself opening up to Lily in a way she hadn't expected. They exchanged stories about their lives, Meredith talking about her restaurant and Lily sharing snippets of her own struggles in the household. There was something grounding about their conversation, as if it tethered Meredith to her purpose. She wasn't just here to cook, she was here to help, even if it felt impossible. The minutes ticked by, and the task ahead seemed increasingly daunting. The ingredients were far from ideal, a strange mix of luxury items and pantry staples that didn't quite fit together. Meredith's mind raced as she tried to piece together a menu that would impress whoever Emma's mysterious guests were. The weight of the unknown pressed down on her, but she forced herself to focus. This was her craft, and she would find a way. Mrs. Hastings returned briefly, her sharp gaze inspecting Meredith's progress. "You'd better not ruin this," she said coldly before disappearing again. Meredith clenched her fists, swallowing the retort that rose to her lips. She didn't need approval from someone like Mrs. Hastings, but the woman's words fueled her determination. If nothing else, Meredith wanted to prove her wrong. As the hours passed, the kitchen began to transform. Dishes took shape, each one a small triumph over the chaos she had walked into. Lily worked diligently at her side, her quiet encouragement helping Meredith push through her exhaustion. Together, they turned a mess into a masterpiece, or so Meredith hoped. There was still so much she couldn't control, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. When the last plate was arranged, Meredith stepped back, her hands trembling slightly. She had done everything she could with what she had, and now it was out of her hands. She glanced at Lily, who gave her a reassuring nod. The dinner was ready, but Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something told her the night's true challenges were still ahead. As the first guests arrived, Meredith remained in the kitchen, her heartbeat steady but quick. From behind the swinging door, she could hear their laughter mingling with the clinking of glasses. It was a world she wasn't a part of, but one she was suddenly responsible for impressing. Mrs. Hastings appeared once again, her sharp eyes scanning the plates. "Make sure it's flawless," she barked before disappearing. Meredith clenched her jaw, feeling the weight of the evening bear down on her shoulders. Lily stayed close, her presence a quiet reminder that Meredith wasn't entirely alone. "You've got this," Lily said, handing her a perfectly folded napkin. The words were simple but sincere, and Meredith felt a flicker of gratitude. She hadn't expected to find an ally here, least of all someone like Lily, whose gentle spirit contrasted starkly with the harshness of the household. Lily's belief in her fueled Meredith's resolve to keep going. But not everyone in the house shared Lily's kindness. The head of the service staff, a man named Robert, seemed determined to undermine Meredith at every turn. "This isn't a charity kitchen," he muttered under his breath as he passed, his tone dripping with disdain. Meredith ignored him, focusing instead on the task at hand. Still, his words stung, a reminder of the invisible barriers she faced as an outsider in this gilded world. The tension in the kitchen thickened as the evening progressed. At one point, a tray of hors d'oeuvres nearly toppled when Robert accidentally bumped into Meredith. She caught it just in time, her fingers gripping the edge of the tray like a lifeline. "Watch where you're going," Robert sneered. Meredith bit her tongue, unwilling to let him derail her focus. She had come too far to let pettiness get in the way. Despite the challenges, small victories kept her spirits afloat. A guest sent word to the kitchen, praising the first course. Lily beamed at the news, her excitement contagious. "See? They love it," she whispered, her eyes shining. Meredith allowed herself a brief smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her why she had taken this leap of faith in the first place. Still, doubts lingered. The main course was the real test, a dish Meredith had improvised using the limited ingredients she'd been given. As she plated each serving, her hands shook slightly. Lily noticed and placed a reassuring hand on Meredith's arm. "You've done harder things than this," she said softly. Meredith nodded, taking a deep breath. She wasn't sure if Lily was right, but she had no choice but to believe her. The moments before the main course was served felt like an eternity. Meredith leaned against the counter, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation and laughter from the dining room. She thought about her restaurant, her staff, and the gamble she had taken by being here. Was it worth it? The answer felt just out of reach, tangled in the layers of uncertainty that cloaked the evening. When the plates returned empty, a wave of relief washed over Meredith. Lily practically jumped with excitement. "You did it," she exclaimed, her joy lighting up the room. Even Mrs. Hastings offered a begrudging nod of approval, though her expression remained as cold as ever. Meredith didn't need words to know she had succeeded, at least for now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the night's most significant moment was still to come. As dessert was being served, Meredith caught a glimpse of Emma through the crack in the door. She was seated at the head of the table, her expression unreadable but her presence commanding. For a moment, Meredith wondered who Emma really was, and why her approval seemed to matter so much. The question lingered as Meredith returned to the kitchen, the night far from over. As dessert dishes were cleared from the table, Meredith found herself leaning against the counter, exhaustion etched into every fiber of her being. The kitchen was quieter now, save for the occasional clink of glassware being washed by Lily. The evening had gone smoother than she'd dared to hope, but a sense of unease lingered. Emma hadn't come to the kitchen, nor sent word about the meal. Her absence felt like a void Meredith couldn't ignore. Lily, ever the optimist, tried to reassure her. "No news is good news, right?" she said with a small smile, but Meredith wasn't convinced. There was something enigmatic about Emma, something that made Meredith feel like she was being tested in ways she didn't fully understand. Was this about the food? Or was there a larger game at play? The unanswered questions gnawed at her as she started cleaning up. Midway through wiping down the counters, Meredith heard the soft click of heels approaching. She looked up to find Emma standing in the doorway, her presence commanding but not unkind. For a moment, the two women simply stared at each other. Emma's expression was unreadable, a blend of curiosity and something Meredith couldn't quite place. It wasn't gratitude, it was more like assessment. "You handled yourself well tonight," Emma said finally, her tone measured. Meredith's stomach churned. The words weren't unkind, but they didn't feel like praise either. "Thank you," Meredith replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Emma stepped further into the kitchen, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if she were gathering evidence for some unseen argument. Meredith felt exposed, as though every decision she had made that night was being dissected under a microscope. "I didn't have much to work with," she said, gesturing to the remaining ingredients, "but I did my best." Emma tilted her head slightly, as if weighing Meredith's words. Sometimes the best results come from scarcity, she said cryptically, before turning to inspect the dessert plates Lily was stacking. The tension in the room was palpable, but Emma's presence also carried a strange sense of calm. Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the dinner, it was about her. Every instinct told her she was being evaluated, not as a chef, but as a person. It was unnerving and humbling all at once. Emma's silence felt like a challenge, daring Meredith to prove herself beyond the meal she had just prepared. Lily, sensing the gravity of the moment, quietly excused herself, leaving Meredith and Emma alone in the kitchen. Meredith busied herself with wiping down the last of the counters, trying to ignore the weight of Emma's gaze. "Why did you come tonight?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the stillness. The question caught Meredith off guard. She hesitated, unsure of how much truth to reveal. "I don't know," Meredith admitted finally, setting the cloth down. "I guess I couldn't ignore the urgency in your voice. It felt like you really needed someone, and I thought I could help." Emma nodded slowly, as though Meredith's words confirmed something she already suspected. "It wasn't an easy choice, was it?" she asked. Meredith shook her head. "No, but it felt like the right one." Emma's lips curved into a faint smile, the first sign of warmth Meredith had seen from her all night. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Emma said softly, almost to herself. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning Meredith couldn't decipher. Before she could respond, Emma straightened, her demeanor shifting back to its composed exterior. "Thank you for tonight. You've done more than you realize." As Emma walked away, Meredith was left standing in the quiet kitchen, her thoughts a tangled mess of emotions. Gratitude, confusion, and an odd sense of pride swirled within her. Whatever had just happened, it felt like a turning point. The night wasn't over yet, but Meredith knew she had crossed an invisible line, one that would change everything moving forward. The dining room was quiet now, the last of the guests having departed into the night. Meredith stood in the kitchen, staring at the scattered remains of her efforts, empty plates, smudged glasses, and faint traces of the evening's success. But the weight of her sacrifice hung heavy on her shoulders. She had given everything tonight, even the premium ingredients she had carefully saved for her restaurant. A silent question echoed in her mind. Was it enough? As she began cleaning up, Mrs. Hastings returned, her sharp heels clicking against the tile floor. "The guests were pleased," she said curtly, but there was no warmth in her tone. Meredith nodded, too tired to muster a reply. Hastings's approval, while grudging, felt hollow. Meredith wasn't looking for validation from her. What she wanted, what she needed, was something deeper, something that would make her sacrifice feel worthwhile. The pang of regret came swiftly. Those ingredients she'd brought, truffle oil, aged balsamic, a rare cut of beef, had been her ace in the hole for an important evening at her restaurant. They weren't just expensive, they were symbolic of her hope for turning things around. Now, they were gone, transformed into a meal for strangers whose names she didn't even know. The thought was bitter, but she swallowed it down. Lily returned with a damp cloth, her face glowing with excitement. "The dinner was perfect," she said, her voice bright. They couldn't stop talking about how incredible everything was. Meredith smiled weakly, grateful for Lily's enthusiasm but unable to share it. The night had taken more from her than she realized. She was drained, not just physically but emotionally. It was hard to celebrate when the cost felt so personal. As they worked together to tidy up, Lily hesitated before speaking again. "You know, you didn't have to do this," she said softly. Meredith paused, meeting Lily's gaze. "Maybe not," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it felt like I should." It was the most honest answer she could give. The decision to help Emma hadn't been logical, but it had been hers. And now, she had to live with it. The kitchen was spotless by the time Emma reappeared, her heels muffled against the clean floor. She moved with an air of quiet authority, her eyes scanning the space before settling on Meredith. "You did well," she said simply. Meredith nodded, unsure of how to respond. Emma's words weren't effusive, but there was something in her tone that hinted at respect. It was small, but it was something. Emma stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "I know tonight wasn't easy for you," she began. "You gave more than I asked for, and I don't take that lightly." Meredith's breath caught in her throat. There was a gravity to Emma's words that made them feel more significant than they seemed on the surface. For the first time that evening, Meredith felt seen, not just as a chef, but as a person. Still, the losses weighed on her. The ingredients, the night at her restaurant, the risk to her reputation, it all felt precarious. "I hope it was worth it," Meredith said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Emma's eyes softened just a fraction. "You'll see," she said enigmatically, before turning and walking away. The promise in her tone lingered, but it left more questions than answers. Meredith stood alone in the kitchen, exhaustion pulling at her every limb. She thought about her grandmother's words, how kindness didn't always bring immediate rewards. Tonight, Meredith had given without expecting anything in return, but she couldn't ignore the aching emptiness that came with sacrifice. Still, beneath the exhaustion, there was a flicker of something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story. The next morning, Meredith returned to her restaurant, the faint scent of garlic and herbs still clinging to her coat. The place felt emptier than usual, her absence the night before leaving a noticeable void. As she unlocked the door, a wave of doubt swept over her. Had her decision to help Emma jeopardized the fragile stability she had worked so hard to maintain? She shook her head, forcing herself to focus on the day ahead. Midway through the morning rush, a sleek black car pulled up outside the restaurant. Meredith barely noticed it, her hands busy kneading dough, until a sharp knock at the door caught her attention. Wiping her hands on her apron, she opened the door to find Emma standing there, looking as poised as ever. Her presence felt out of place against the humble backdrop of Meredith's little restaurant. "May I come in?" Emma asked, her tone polite but firm. Meredith stepped aside, her curiosity piqued. Emma's gaze swept over the modest space, her expression unreadable. "It's charming," she said, though Meredith couldn't tell if it was a compliment or an observation. "But it's clear you're working against impossible odds." The words stung, but Meredith held her ground, waiting to see where this conversation was headed. Emma reached into her sleek leather bag and pulled out a folder, placing it carefully on the counter. "You impressed me last night," she began, her voice steady. "Your talent, your composure under pressure, it's rare. I'd like to offer you an opportunity." Meredith's breath hitched as Emma slid the folder toward her. Inside was a contract, the terms detailed in bold letters. Emma wanted her to head a new restaurant, a flagship for her chain. For a moment, Meredith couldn't speak. The offer was staggering, a lifeline she hadn't dared to hope for. The salary alone could wipe out her debts, and the prestige of working with someone like Emma was unmatched. But with the excitement came hesitation. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a massive change, one that would pull her away from the restaurant she had poured her soul into. "I don't know what to say," Meredith finally stammered. Emma smiled faintly, a glimmer of warmth in her otherwise composed demeanor. "Say yes," she replied simply. "Your restaurant is special, but you've outgrown it. With the resources I can provide, you could do so much more." Meredith's heart raced as she considered the possibilities. The chance to create without constraints, to reach a wider audience. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. But the thought of leaving her restaurant behind felt like a betrayal. Meredith glanced around the familiar space, the worn tiles and mismatched chairs suddenly feeling like old friends. "What happens to this place?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Emma tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "That's up to you," she said. "But if you stay here, you'll always be fighting to keep it afloat. Isn't it time you stopped just surviving?" Emma's words hit Meredith like a punch to the gut. She had spent years in survival mode, scraping by on grit and determination alone. The idea of stepping into a role where her talent could truly shine was intoxicating, but it also felt terrifying. "I'll need time to think," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. Emma nodded as if she had expected this. "Take the weekend," she said. "But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait." As Emma left, Meredith sat alone at the counter, the contract still lying open before her. The weight of the decision loomed large, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like a choice she could make on her terms. The seed of hope planted the night before had begun to grow, and Meredith couldn't help but wonder how far it might take her. The weekend passed in a blur of restless thoughts and sleepless nights. Meredith spent hours pacing the creaky floors of her apartment, the contract Emma had left sitting untouched on her kitchen table. Her mind was a battleground of possibilities. On one side, the offer promised financial stability, creative freedom, and the chance to finally step out of survival mode. On the other, it meant walking away from the little restaurant that had become an extension of herself. Sunday morning found Meredith back in her restaurant, kneading dough in the quiet hours before opening. The familiar rhythm of her work was a balm to her restless mind. She glanced around at the peeling paint, the scratched counters, and the mismatched chairs. Every imperfection held a story, a reminder of the years she had poured into this place. Could she really leave it behind? Her regulars trickled in as the day went on, their faces lighting up when they saw her. They asked about her absence on Friday, teasing her about having a secret life outside the restaurant. Meredith laughed along, but her thoughts remained elsewhere. These were the people who had kept her going through the hardest times. Could she abandon them for a bigger stage, even if it meant realizing her dreams? Late in the afternoon, Lily walked in, carrying a bag of fresh herbs. She had become a regular visitor since Friday night, her admiration for Meredith clear in every word and gesture. "You've been quiet," Lily said, her brow furrowed. "Still thinking about the offer?" Meredith nodded, her hands still busy shaping dough. "It's a lot to take in," she admitted. "I just don't know if I'm ready to let this place go." Lily set the herbs on the counter and leaned against it, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe you don't have to," she said. Meredith looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" Lily shrugged. "You could do both. Keep this place as a community space, something for the people here, and take the job to grow your career. It doesn't have to be all or nothing." The idea sparked something in Meredith, a glimmer of a possibility she hadn't considered. That evening, Meredith sat in her tiny office, staring at the contract once more. Lily's words played over in her mind. Could she really balance both worlds? The thought was daunting, but it also felt right. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, "The best choices are the ones that scare you just enough to know they're worth it." With a deep breath, Meredith picked up the pen and signed her name. The next morning, she called Emma. The older woman answered on the second ring, her tone brisk but expectant. "I'll take the job," Meredith said, her voice steady. "But I'd like to talk about how I can keep my restaurant as part of the deal." There was a pause, and then Emma's voice softened. "I had a feeling you'd say that. Let's discuss the details." As Meredith hung up, a wave of emotions washed over her, relief, excitement, and a lingering trace of fear. She didn't know exactly how this new chapter would unfold, but she knew one thing for certain: she was finally stepping into her potential. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like her road, paved with the choices she had made and the risks she was willing to take. Months passed, and Meredith's life became a seamless dance between her bustling new restaurant and the revitalized community space she had left behind. The two worlds, once seemingly at odds, now complemented each other in ways she hadn't imagined. The restaurant brought her acclaim, stability, and the tools to dream bigger. The community space, now a hub for aspiring chefs, gave her purpose and a connection to her roots. Together, they formed the perfect balance. Meredith's return to the neighborhood always drew a crowd. Children gathered around her, eager to taste her latest creations, while parents shared stories of how the community kitchen had become a beacon of hope. Young chefs, once unsure of their paths, now worked with confidence, their skills honed under Meredith's guidance. Watching their progress filled her with a deep, quiet pride. She wasn't just building her career, she was building a legacy. One evening, while overseeing a cooking workshop at the community space, Meredith paused to reflect on how far she had come. The memories of sleepless nights, mounting debts, and self-doubt seemed distant but not forgotten. They had shaped her, given her the resilience to embrace risks and the humility to recognize the role others had played in her journey. Her grandmother's words, "Kindness never returns empty-handed," echoed in her heart, their truth undeniable. Meredith's impact began to ripple beyond her immediate circles. Local businesses started donating supplies to the community space, inspired by her vision of giving back. Media outlets featured her story, painting her as a symbol of resilience and generosity. But Meredith remained grounded, her focus on the people who had supported her along the way. "This isn't about me," she told one reporter. "It's about what we can accomplish when we lift each other up." One day, Emma visited the community space unannounced, her sharp elegance contrasting with the warm, bustling kitchen. She watched quietly as Meredith guided a group of teenagers through a baking lesson, her voice patient and encouraging. When the session ended, Emma approached Meredith with a rare smile. "You've created something remarkable," she said. "I knew you were talented, but this is extraordinary." Meredith shrugged, her cheeks flushing slightly. "It's not just me," she said. "It's the community. They gave me the courage to keep going when things were tough. I just wanted to give something back." Emma nodded, her gaze softening. "You've done more than that. You've shown people what's possible when you don't let fear hold you back." Later that night, Meredith sat in her quiet apartment, reflecting on Emma's words. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt, the unexpected allies. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. She realized that her success wasn't just measured by accolades or financial stability. It was in the lives she had touched, the opportunities she had created, and the hope she had ignited. Meredith's story spread far and wide, inspiring others to take risks, embrace kindness, and believe in the power of community. Her little restaurant, now managed by Lily, continued to thrive as a space for connection and growth. And Meredith, with her feet firmly planted in two worlds, found herself at peace. She had returned with more than just success. She had returned with purpose, a reminder that true wealth lies in what we give to others.